So this session is being recorded. Hello, everyone, and welcome. Welcome to our roundtable discussion as part of the larger symposium, Teaching at UCLA, Looking Forward with 2020 Vision. I'm Adrienne Levine. I lead the Center for the Advancement of Teaching, and I'm also a faculty member in Mechanical and Aerospace Engineering. I'm joined by co-facilitator Kumiko Haas, Director of Instructional Improvement Programs in CAT. It was Kumiko's idea to hold a roundtable discussion, taking a broad look at how the events of the past year might affect the way we think about teaching in the future. I will soon turn the floor over to Clarence Braddock, our moderator, to introduce the topic of the roundtable more fully. But let me first present the panelists, and you will see that they come at the question of how teaching may change from a variety of perspectives. Clarence Braddock, our moderator, is Vice Dean for Education in the David Geffen School of Medicine. Jeffrey Lewis is Professor of Political Science and Chair of the College Faculty Executive Committee. Victoria Marks is Associate Dean of Academic Affairs in the School of Arts and Architecture and Chair of the Disability Studies minor. David Schaberg is Dean of the Division of Humanities and Senior Dean of the College. And I don't know if Abel has joined us yet.
Yes, he has.
He has. So he has his own interesting story of the morning. But Abel Valenzuela is Professor of Chicana and Chicano Studies and Urban Planning and Director of UCLA's Institute for Research on Labor and Employment. We expect today's discussion to take around an hour and a quarter. You're welcome to put comments in the chat as a sidebar conversation. We may have an opportunity to intersperse a few audience comments or questions. And now I turn it over to Clarence to begin the discussion.
Thanks so much, Adrienne, and welcome colleagues. I say that to my colleagues on the panel, but also to all you colleagues who have joined today for this roundtable discussion. It probably goes without saying, but I'll just say to additionally frame today, we've been talking about and really reflecting on what a year it's been. Just thinking back to a year ago today and the things we were facing and what we've had to do as teachers, as people, and responding to the pandemic. The tragic killing of George Floyd last summer foregrounded in all of our minds, racial injustice and racism, and containing that in everything from society to the classroom. And the list goes on and on. It's really been a challenging year, but the challenging year has brought with it some observations that we can all make about how we've responded to that in our teaching and learning. And that's really going to be the focus of our conversation today. And we really do want it to be a conversation. My panelists, co-panelists and I will reflect a bit on sort of lessons learned and takeaways from this past year, and hope that will stimulate in all of you some reflections of what you've taken away. And we do want this to be a conversation in which you can put things into the chat that come to mind as we talk, observations and experiences, what things you've learned to share with colleagues. And it really is in that spirit of sharing that we have this conversation today. The ground rules is that we're going to just talk and sort of share reflections over the first half-ish of our time together. And as we see comments in the chat, and they will like to comment on those, bring those to the foreground, but really want to hear and see in the chat your own reflections on what you've taken away from this past year. So to start things out, I'm just going to open it up to the panelists. This is a fantastic group of colleagues. When we met a couple of times to discuss this, we just found ourselves jumping right into the conversation, and I'm sure we will today. So I'll just open the floor and say, top of mind as you reflect on this past year, some major sort of takeaways in terms of what the experience, what things should we carry forward as we think about our roles as faculty, as leaders, and moving into the future.
David, why don't you start us off?
I'd be glad to. Thanks for the invitation. I did a little bit of consultation with the chairs in the division to hear what kinds of things were coming to their minds. And, the things that came along, and I think the things that'll come into the conversation today are in many cases, the same sorts of things that all of us have been noticing. And I want to try to gather that with just one word, an odd choice, but the word is plasticity. And what I mean is that where a year and a half ago, we would have gone to our classroom and addressed our students, perhaps with some awareness of the other possibilities. A year ago, we were forced into our classroom in exactly this form, and with a great deal of attention to the downside, as would have come naturally. It was in the succeeding months that all of us began to be aware of those silver lining things. And that's what I'm trying to gather in the term plasticity. We have much more control right now over the range, variety, employment or non-employment of other media of communication around teaching. I mean, this thing is a sort of paltry imitation of what we do in the classroom. But meanwhile, we go over to the chat, right? Dean Braddock invited us to do this. Adrian invited us to use the chat. People I was consulting with were pointing out the possibility of using things like Google Docs, that is, other threads to the ongoing real-time conversation. And so I guess the one thing I want to throw into the conversations we get started today is that notion, our new awareness of the manipulability, not of the students, but of the setting, the way that we can control, change, adjust, focus, broaden the actual mode of communication. It's something I desperately want to keep even when we get back into the classroom.
Yeah, sort of hearing a sense of sort of the challenges with that plasticity. It's a great word, by the way, in terms of trying to adapt what we're accustomed to doing to a different kind of context, but along the way realizing some of the opportunities. The chat function and Q&A and some of the technical features certainly have been an interesting asset. Even the sort of sense in which how we interact. I've always felt like that the Zoom screen, particularly in gallery view, is an interesting sort of phenomenon. I love hear your comments on it. In a way, assuming people have their cameras on, that's a whole nother topic. But in a way, it kind of brings everyone into an equal stance in a way that the classroom can, but really doesn't. There's someone in the front row, someone in the back row, and here everyone's in an equal stance. That's sort of one image that will stick with me from this past year.
Yeah, I think that's right. Like, one of the things that's been really sort of interesting to me, I always sort of in general think about the idea that being confronted with choices is very informative about your own preferences. You can sort of have this predisposition about what it is that you think is the right way to do something. You could be the kind of person who sort of thinks of themselves as really liking foreign films, but then when you get to the movie theater, if we can imagine once again going to a movie theater, then you realize that actually you mostly see blockbusters, superhero movies. That somehow the reality clashes a little bit, and I think that that's something that's really happened here too. That both for us but I think also for students, both of us have learned a lot about what is and sort of isn't sort of central, and what sort of concerns we have about change that are more or less salient. And so I think one of the things from the perspective of the chair of the college faculty, where we are starting to see a lot of requests to move permanently certain kinds of instruction to a remote mode, to promote the inclusion and the new sort of broader attention to new different learning styles and so forth that attends that. And so this isn't even a case where we get to the movie theater and make the decision. Here we're being forced to watch a blockbuster movie and decide maybe we like that pretty well. And I think that's been a really important thing, and trying to understand how the experience of the last year will translate when we go back to a different context, I think will be a really important part of
that sort of blockbuster. Yeah, Bill, I'm going to just point out this one interesting thing, and that is, sometimes we go to the blockbuster movie, but the blockbuster movie goes to us, and it's just a fabulous thing for reasons that you could decide or not decide to say. But here you're able to participate, Bill. It looks like you're in the front seat of your car.
Yes, and Jeffrey, good friend and colleague, sparked a couple of comments related to, of course, access. And access, I think, brings lots of hope, excitement, possibilities with remote learning. But in my own personal context right now in the present, I'm parked right across the street from Lincoln Park, not too far away from Boyle Heights, where I grew up. It's a poor working class community. I'm parked in my nice car with my 16-year-old, who I managed to get a vaccination appointment. And I asked myself, would I have done this if this was in person, if, schedule an appointment for him? And probably not. I would have figured it something a little bit more convenient, so that it would not hamper my work life, right? But I'll tell you one thing. On Friday, when my sisters reached out to me and said, look, you can get an appointment and they're vaccinated 16-year-olds, I did not hesitate to not only book this appointment today, but about an hour before our panel, thinking that it would go relatively quick, because it has in the past. It took a little bit longer because it was mostly a long line, but here I am, engaging with all of you, connecting with my son. And I think about what that means to me in my own work life, and of course, other faculty, staff, and students who now, in this remote sort of environment, can connect on a level that I will admit I've not been able to do with my 16-year-old as a result of this past year at home and being able to balance those challenges in work. It makes me feel good. It makes me feel like the university is giving me this flexibility. And I know that I sit in a different position as a faculty member who's very privileged. But there's something about that new access to life, to work, to appointments, to your children, that to me holds a lot of promise for colleagues, for women, for single-headed households, and for others who are trying to manage an increasingly hectic and disconnected world in some ways. I'm saying a lot here, but I'm trying to put, I think, a really positive spin to access and to touch on some issues related to inequality and how this is gonna, in some ways, move things a little bit more equal. Lots of issues and problems to assess, but I think the door has opened. Much more than that, maybe the train has left, as Jeff has suggested, and we're thinking about what this means moving forward.
Vic, you had something to add?
Yeah, I can't believe that you're able to focus on these two, where you are and the subject at the same time. I'm very impressed. But I also want to think about this unification of your private life, your family life, and work, and the ways in which this overlap, and maybe a slightly different perspective on this. Just earlier this morning, I was thinking, so what are the conditions of this past year? And not only about learning about technologies for teaching remotely, but this has been a period of hardship, of loss, of isolation, precarity, violence, a deepening of the reckoning with systemic racism, more so for some of us than for others of us who are paying attention all along. I will readily admit that it's been a learning year in a profound way. And so students, presumably, faculty for sure, don't come to the classroom in a state of readiness. That the sense of our sort of pure focus is upended as we're sitting in cars with our sons and daughters and pets, I don't know, and that separation of private life from work life is really been challenged. And so that makes me think about what is the role of the classroom, not only in terms of our communication styles, i.e. technologies, but what do we mean to have happened there? And even more so because if our students can come to the classroom remotely, it's also that they can't join they can't be with the club. They can't join in the social activities except for remotely. So what role might the classroom play to both provide the space where we connect our individual lives that are where there's great struggle and strife with what we're learning in that room, and how do we build social connection where there's a tremendous absence of social connection? I'm sorry I said so much, but
No.
those were the things that were on my mind.
Yeah, the social connection is, I think, something we definitely want to reflect on a bit. There was something earlier in what you said about, I just wanted to comment on that. The notion of Abel, you mentioned privilege, and Vic, you mentioned sort of this idea that we've been forced to try to be present even when there's things that may be right here, and that is a certain kind of a different kind of vulnerability. I think about, fortunately, Belle's not driving. We actually had a student who was in the car, but the car was moving, and that was very disconcerting for everyone involved. But individuals who, people who have, small children are bopping around, and also just the vulnerability, particularly for some of our students who are not in physical surround where they, either because of technology bandwidth or just because of the nature of the space that they're in. It's a kind of vulnerability that I think that we don't see in the classroom. Someone comes to the classroom, and in a sense, we don't know what's in the context of their life in the way that Zoom somehow, in a way, brings us into one another's lives. In a way, I've got a fake background, otherwise you'd see the the messy room I'm sitting in. But it is a kind of a vulnerability, isn't it?
I think so. I mean, one of the really curious things is that this, sort of status of aloneness, we're all sort of alone, has in some ways, I think, really increased our other regardingness, which is an odd juxtaposition, but I think an important one. And of course, I think also, if we reflect on a lot of the events of the year, it has sort of focused, I think, for a lot of people on sort of the impacts that things all over have on different people in the different contexts and places that people come from. And that's, of course, laid completely bare, as you say, through methods like Zoom, where we really are able to sort of contemplate and speculate and sort of imagine in a way that undifferentiated students might not be able to, sitting in a classroom, what the different circumstances that their colleagues are facing. And we've seen that a lot, where normally the kinds of requests for some sort of grievance to be addressed or so forth are very parochial in nature, like exactly who's going to be bringing them, and that's been very different, I think, this year, where people have really been thinking a lot about maybe this situation isn't so bad for me as a student, but I see this other group of students for whom it's clearly a challenge. These bleary-eyed international students 6 time zones away, or students, as you say, with young children in their learning environment and so forth. So I think it's been very instructive that way. And I think the interesting thing, again, will be to think about, not conflating technology with the broader circumstance. So we think about what did or didn't work right now. And I think it's going to be very hard to tell how much of that is, for a while at least, of what was working and not working and so forth, was really around these sort of technologies and possible opportunities that are there, versus just this sort of incredible, I think, kind of amazing esprit de corps that you all have, faculty have shown and students have shown during this difficult time. And of course that sadly, I think will wane over time.
Yeah. David, looks like you had something to add.
Yeah, I'm really hoping that people out there in the group will also jump in on some of these issues. I want to reflect a little bit on the paradox of access, right? And I thought that what Jeff and what Vic said really set that up beautifully. It's not that we've gone from less access to more access necessarily. I think we've gone from one model of access, that model in which unknown students show up in our classroom and we teach them from behind a podium. It's a much older model. We've been moving towards something more inclusive, which I take to mean something more knowledgeable about individual students and their learning backgrounds. That was coming along. Then we went through this sudden deformation of the classroom to this virtual thing. which brings additional access and cuts off other forms of access. And
Mhm.
I'd love if we can to reflect on the question of whether we expect our students to show their faces to us. Obviously, there are cynical reasons for them not to show their faces. They may still be napping, but there are many other reasons. I've chosen to show my messy room here.
Not very messy.
Not too messy. No, I'm not showing all of it either. The other side that I really like us to get into, if we can, is the way that we've actually changed the place where the university is happening. Obviously this call is connecting us in a network. I have no idea how big it is, how much of the city or beyond it covers. But the university is in places right now through this meeting where it wouldn't have been last year. Classes have been in places in homes across the city and around the world where they haven't been. And that means that thing that we used to pat ourselves on the back for doing, when we bring groups of students, young people to campus so they can see what the campus is like and feel how they might be included here, something like that is happening elsewhere. Can we capitalize on that? Can we turn this into greater access? Obviously, we're doing that in really marked ways with programs for incarcerated students, for example. But that's a tiny slice of what's happening here. So I see that as the obverse of the difficulty where you might be sitting outside of McDonald's with your cell phone trying to get into your class. Well, your class has also reached you in that place of difficulty.
In a funny way, going back to Vic, you mentioned sort of social connectedness, and this, it almost in a way, access the ability for, I certainly know our students who were able to do some remote learning could really be anywhere, and in times of significant stress, many chose to be elsewhere with family or others, and that's a really positive thing. But then what does it mean, as you said, David, what does it mean to be on a campus? I mean, I guess there's sort of like, we've gained some flexibility and plasticity in access, but are we, I think what you're asking is, are we losing a sense of like, why be physically at the university? Huh?
Let's not lose that.
Yeah, Vic.
Oh, I'm just looking in the chat and seeing these, really wonderful comments about vulnerability, identity, and space. I guess Daryl made a really important comment that for some students who are, if you don't mind my reading Daryl's comment.
Oh, please.
I think, to Professor Marx's point, for a lot of queer students, they're living in situations where they're not able to be their authentic selves. And in many ways, this shift towards distance learning has prevented a key moment of validation and expression that they would otherwise have, presumably if they'd been on campus, where they can claim their identities without the pressures of family and so on.
Mm-hmm.
And on the other hand, prior to that, there was a comment by Kathy about the distance has allowed faculty to be more humanized and to break down artificial barriers. So just to your point, David, about, there's pros and cons for each. And if we're thinking about equity and access for everyone, there's not one solution. We're seeing that there are problems in all ways. So I just wanted to throw that in. And also the thought, thank you, Daryl. I've been thinking that there's a presumption that the campus itself, the physical campus, is a place of some form of neutrality. And I was thinking, no, it's not. It's not a form of neutrality. It's a safe place for some and not a safe place for others. And Daryl helped me think about the ways in which home is a safe place for some and not for others.
Yeah, it's an interesting point. I'm thinking about sort of the other side of that coin, which is that coming to campus allows me to sort of don a particular persona. If I'm the faculty, back to your comment, David, I know I'm going to be in front of the podium, in front of the class, a certain positionality that I lose when I'm, on Zoom, either because my kid runs behind me or I get stuck in the elevator, or I fumble with the technology, that the humanization. And so that's is it democratizing? I don't know. I do think also for the, when we leave our home environment, we're able to control in some ways the persona we choose to present in a way that not always is possible to do when we're at home. I don't know, I may be over-interpreting the comments in the chat, but I do think they're really provocative in thinking about, this question of what are the upsides and what are the challenges with us being, in this kind of environment as opposed to, physically together.
I don't think
Abel, you're sitting there in the car, and you again, I just keep the image is just so perfect for today, because it's like you're able to be here, and yet there's you're in the middle of other things that are happening in your life.
And listen to this. I feel connected with each of you in part because we've shared emails, and we had that one previous discussion in which we had somewhat of a conversation similar to this, and in some ways that connectedness I'd like to translate into a humanness. When I first taught this past summer, towards the end of the summer, I held virtual hangouts with a group of transfer students, and I checked in with each of them in simple ways. And I think I learned that check-in in part from going to one of these workshops about just saying their names and then asking them how they're doing, just a real basic check-in. And I'd never done that in person, not in one of my big classes with 40 or 50 students. But that connection and then subsequent virtual hangouts just to see how folks were doing when the pandemic was raging, and I'm trying to teach students about inequality in labor markets, was a completely different orientation for me and my students. And it brought us together in ways that I had never experienced in my 24 years at UCLA. Now, I'm a pretty friendly person, and when I walk into my in-person classroom, I'm not one of these, very uptight professors. At least I don't think I am. But I did take it to the next level during this remote pandemic period. And I felt a level of humanity with my students that I had not experienced before. And that was their struggles with technology, their struggles with death, their struggles with making sense of all of that. And so I think this was something, this remote everything that made a difference. Now, I don't want to suggest that this is all positive. I'm just pointing out one particular experience and how we might channel that as we transition to hybrid or back to in-person.
Yeah, no, there definitely are positives. I mean, one similar thing that occurs to me, so is not from last year, was just we had a sort of a campus revisit day for medical school applicants, which we usually would do in person, and there's so much emphasis on that building of community. We had to kind of stand up the thing virtually, and it felt very, very awkward. But the experience actually led to a series of very impromptu conversations with small groups of applicants for the rest of the spring, which were actually were just wonderful in the sense of a different way of building community. And they were connecting through a group meet community. So there are positives. There's a comment in the chat, a few comments about impact for the positives for access for students with disabilities, for example.
I'll jump in on that one. Thanks, Clarence. Not by any means do I feel an expert on the subject of access and disability, but Kat, thank you for your comment. And I actually feel like I want to return to something David said earlier, that there are different qualities of access in these different modes of teaching. And I'm just thinking, for example, that while travel, access to buildings, the opportunity to be up close to another speaker's face and read the face are all strengths of these Zoom technologies. I know, for example, that individuals who can't keyboard for whatever set of reasons find that these technologies are nearly impossible. For people who struggle with looking at a screen, now I know probably all of us will agree that looking at a screen for the amount of hours that we do is terribly challenging, but there are different degrees of our, I don't know, could I throw in plasticity here? About our ability to spend time with a screen. But for some people, it's a tremendous, tremendous challenge, even for an hour, to be focused in this way. So I hear what you're saying, Kat, but I also want to remind us that Zoom is also an ableist technology, and it gives access to some and not to others. Thanks.
Yeah, no, there's some great comments. This access thread keeps coming back around. David in the chat talks about the upside of having so many graduate students from around the world auditing your class. And this question, I think I'd love to hear your comments on. I know we've been thinking a lot about. We talked about this a little bit the other day. Like, what will happen when we return? And this question is really, well, wait a second. Are we returning? Should we return? What does return mean? And yeah, just to start it off, I'd say that on reflection of all these examples of ways in which this accident of history, this terrible pandemic and all that's happened this past year forced us to think differently about how we might conceptualize the teacher-learner relationship, the sense of community. It does open up possibilities that we probably shouldn't let go of. But I actually, so David, I actually don't know the answer to what returning to the classroom means. There are many examples of things in our realm where we're actually not going to return to the classroom. So one example is when the medical students go out to do their clinical rotations, they might be at a county hospital out in the valley. One might be down in Torrance, and they're all supposed to go to the same lecture series. So you have 4 or 5 different locations where we're trying to reproduce the same exact lecture series on the second Wednesday of the month. Well, so now we've replaced that with one lecture that everyone can join via Zoom. And there's a sense of all the students on that rotation coming back together, albeit virtually. You have, you can get like one person to deliver the lecture. So I actually don't know what returning means. I'd love to hear your guys' thoughts on that.
I think it is a really good question, and one that we're struggling I think very much with right now to think about should the sort of rules of the game be changed, and certainly in a lot of things I'm sure that will be the case. I know with respect to, for example, alumni events and so forth, been just getting incredible turnout at these things because I think in part you don't have to fight traffic to come, and the idea of being able to reach 10 times as many people, clearly that's going to be something that will continue. I think a lot of these things like office hours and the kind of check-ins that Abel talked about, it's as a faculty member and at the sort of industrial scale that especially in the college we operate, the ability to do that in a much more efficient way is really powerful. And to just go back a minute to something we're talking about before, which is that part of the college experience, that sort of critical part that isn't really happening in the classroom. When I sit on the Council of Planning and Budget and they come and report on the impacts of remote learning, and one of the things they talk about is the impact on auxiliaries. And of course, auxiliaries mean basically, and we're thinking about there from a financial perspective, but auxiliaries are like, housing and food service and so forth and so on. But when you think about the role that the university plays in the development of young people, that which is auxiliary to us in a sort of accounting sense is really in some ways primary. And that's something that will change when we come back. There will be, we hope in the fall, 15,000 undergraduates back on the Hill, and there will be those spaces and places for the sort of people to express their sort of true selves and to engineer their true selves to become that person they're going to be, and we're going to get that. And so the question is then sort of how do we blend that with the kinds of things that you're talking about? And that's where I think we will have this pivot a little bit from access, which we can focus on really now because everybody's kind of in that same footing. We're all remote. And then I think those questions of access will increasingly become questions of equity. You know, if we take the best parts of the remote experience and we make it available while then reintroducing, you know, all the advantages that one gets from being on campus, then a lot of the things that we think about as being great right now with respect to access, like being able to check in from your car from the other side of town, you know, well, that's still, there's an equity issue there because the student who can access all of that opportunity but still live on campus is differently situated than the commuter student, and so forth and so on.
Yeah, totally. Yeah.
For
David.
me, this same set of questions really forces me to a sort of righteous conviction kind of thing. We cannot give up the ideal of the campus where people interact in real space with each other, with their full bodily selves. And we have to maintain that commitment for all students, even as we grab the other forms of access that are coming with us. And I think about this both when we're talking in the administration about how the pandemic may change the balance of teleworking and on-campus working people. Are we going to start having people who live further from campus in more affordable places telecommute so that the people who live in commuting distance can appear and have a beautiful but completely skewed on-campus community? No, let's not do that. Also, let's not do that with students either. And let's not give up the ideals that have us toward greater actual physical accessibility. And when I think about the question that Alan has raised here, this great question of how we're going to keep all of this great stuff while we go back to, you know, the millennia-old business of sitting with students, we're starting to think, mainly through our research centers right now, but it'll happen in our classrooms as well, to how we can most effectively get the experience of live encounter to our audiences, you know, how we can share that remotely, even as we're continuing to do it in person. And I think we have a lot to learn, you know, as instructors, as impresarios, and how to do that for the new university. I don't think that's a return. I think that's a step forward.
Yeah, I do wonder if, and both of you, Jeff and David, just sort of alluded to, you know, how these choices do disproportionately impact our students along economic, you know, and racial lines. And I think about the kind of the commuter student who, you know, just to think aloud, it's like, what does the classroom on campus experience mean? Is it a positive? Is it neutral? Is it negative? And I suspect it's yes, it may be, depending right on the individual circumstances. And I do worry a little bit that there are you know, thousands of narratives of ways in which an individual learner's, you know, life as a student is marginally better or marginally worse, and that's not equitably distributed across our student body.
I wonder if it would be worth just taking a moment following up on what's recently been spoken about, what it is about in person that we value as we learn, since we're not in person. You know, I think one of the things that just pops into my mind, and I'd actually like to just open it up to everyone here and in the chat, is spontaneity. We have to learn to wait, to not talk over someone. And there's a new relationship to time and stillness while we find out whether it's okay to speak. And so spontaneity, I think, is a very powerful form of interaction in that, you know, you could argue, you could jump in, you could laugh, you could make side comments. Here, everything matters in a way that in person, the kind of, I don't know, I'm using my fingers to describe, you know, something less linear is going on. So I'll just throw that thought out as, not throw it out, but throw it in to think about what's important about in person. And maybe others of you might have some thoughts on that.
Going back to an earlier comment in the chat, I would say it is only in person. I mean, it's really the opposite side of the observation made about being queer. Safer to be at home. Excuse me, no. In certain ways, difficult to be at home with a family that may not be sympathetic. In certain ways, Zoom gives access. But I venture to say that one thing that the campus experience does for students is allow them to come and live in their real bodies with their real selves in a newly liberated way, right? It's a separation from home, it's a separation from past, it's an effort to become new. You got to do that in person. I'm sure we can figure out some way to do that in a denatured Zoom way, but please, let's not go there, right? Campus, in so many ways, is where people come to test out their new adult selves. And I don't think we can do that virtually.
A couple of comments now, I think, in the chat around the challenges with assessment. I think that is interesting. And one of the interesting things that we'll be looking for, I think, moving forward is just how tied to notions of assessment that we've used in the past we have to remain. A little bit of a subject change, David. I apologize for that, but it did just occur to me, and one of the things I think we try to do is just to sort of see moving forward, how did the students who went through classes during this period, how do they do in the subsequent coursework, and how necessary are some of the sorts of assessment that we've been not able to use. We know that a lot of that assessment is not optimal in other ways. So it'll be very interesting, I think, to look at that. But at the same time, it does raise this very fundamental question, which is, are we able to deliver the knowledge generation that we're meant to deliver in the classroom? And I think it's great to really think about all of the ways in which the classroom contributes to community and development. But there is also that sort of domain knowledge, and we have to, I think, not lose sight of that. So I'm very sympathetic to the idea that we feel like right now we're driving a little bit. Maybe to speak to a Bell circumstance a little bit, in the fog, because we don't have these standard tools for sort of figuring out whether we think students are really learning what we would like them to. So I think that's going to be something to be very sensitive to moving forward, because there might be real opportunity there as well.
Yeah, I think it's a good point. I would add to that, even just student learning, and the obvious example of whether it's assessment of learning or assessment for learning, or just student learning of kind of in-person application activities, whether they be labs in the sciences or performing arts or other kinds of interactions, which are we believe are necessary or at least advantageous for learning. And certainly a lot of the conversation I recall early on in sort of the various schools where there was a sense that, gosh, for this particular discipline, this particular department, this particular major, there's some activities which, can you coach performing arts in Zoom? Well, probably, but the ability to do that becomes very challenged. The ability to teach anatomy in medical school is very difficult to do. So I do wonder a little bit whether net learning is, I mean, certainly maybe there's some advantages of ways to promote learning, but there's some things lost. And this connects to, like, what's the reason to be on campus? Sometimes it is, yes, for social connectedness and for the experience and for interpersonal interactions. And sometimes it's necessary for student learning.
No question. I just also, another thing that I think would be fun to talk a little bit about is this idea that facilitating training of students to be able to work effectively in groups, which I think is so important for preparing them for the workforce in the future, is also a challenge. But I feel like that's in some ways really a challenge to us, because all of the concerns that we're talking about today, I think, are going to be also sort of recapitulated in the workplace more generally. And so figuring out how to help people learn how to work together when they're apart is going to be a challenge, not just for us in our classrooms, but also really something that we're going to need to teach students. I've been listening to this a book on the 2020 campaign where the leaders of the campaigns were talking about how difficult it was to manage a campaign in which they hadn't met almost anybody who worked for it. And obviously that won't necessarily be exactly the case in the future, hopefully. But I do think that the same, increased sort of remoteness and distributedness of collective effort is going to be something we're going to see, and we're going to need to get good at teaching students how to navigate it.
I'm just going to insert one invitation to Adrian and Kamiko, as you guys are also scanning the chat. If you see any good things, there's some great comments. I was looking at a comment from Muriel about office hours, and just again, sort of a fantastic example of the the things that happen and how to recreate those. Again, there's for learning and assessment, there's for social interaction, but that kind of mentorship and I don't know, just a sense of community. We keep coming back to this notion of community and how do we even define that? What ran through my mind in this last bit of chat was just thinking about just our broader society and how, not to sound a little bit like an old guy or something, but our traditional ways of interacting have changed in the past few decades in terms of how people remain connected. And there's sort of this foundation of digital connectedness, which the so-called digital natives are quite comfortable with, but folks of my generation needed to learn. So I don't know if that factors into this, but I wonder if that impacts how we feel about what's lost, what's been lost versus what hasn't. I don't know if any of you have thoughts on that. Or
maybe very briefly, in my own teaching, I taught a couple of courses during the pandemic period. And in what I was hearing from faculty members in the humanities, I thought I discerned a phenomenon like, thank God we're in class together. Let's make a community of it. And this, I think I hear it coming out of the other comments as well. I'm sort of especially emphasizing the humanities part of it for myself. I always think of the humanities artifact as the thing that you put among yourselves so that you can interact across it and learn each other through it and so forth. I think I was especially moved this quarter when I heard from relatively young professor of Russian literature who said that his fall students had spent the quarter living in Anna Karenina together, like just inhabiting that novel, making it the kind of basis on which they were interacting and getting to know each other. I don't know how that community lasts afterward. But I guess, yet again, I'm seeing that Zoom showed us something that we were already doing. We didn't really know it was there. It was a need that asserted itself as soon as we couldn't be together. People sort of flocked to the intellectual community of the classroom or in separate settings of our research centers as well, where participation in events went way up. I see the desire for community revealed.
Yeah. I think a lot of people, go ahead, please.
No, I was just going to bring up a question in the chat. Daryl Barker, he had asked about a question to the I'll read it, but Daryl, you can please clarify. So he says, do you think the experience of the pandemic has shifted the way faculty can support student organizing and activism?
Well, it's an interesting question. I mean, I'll start and the others chime in. I'd love to hear others' comments in the chat about what your experience has been. I think many faculty are asked to advise or support in other ways activism. Certainly, the events. I think of the murder of George Floyd, other just even the events of this past weekend. Just they seem to be right here in ways that I don't know if it's different now but at any rate, it's certainly a very present sense. And I could, speaking for our students, you feel it very strongly, particularly students of color, but not just. And so when those events have happened in other parts of campus. In a non-pandemic era, there'd be a lot of ways in which there'd be people coming together to try to process and share and support one another. We actually, we're fortunate in the medical school. We have a health equity lounge where students have in the past gathered to informally or formally, and you don't have those spaces. Then you have to kind of create them. And so again, I'm just rambling here a bit, but the creation of those spaces is a little bit, I think for everyone, it's felt a little bit unsatisfying. So if you hold let's have a Zoom meeting, we're all going to kind of process. But back to your point, Vic, that processing is rather different because I'm going to speak and you're going to wait till I'm done. There's a little pause till you speak. That's not the same feeling as when we gather in a physical space to say, what are we going to do about X happened? What are we collectively going to do about it? What are we going to do individually, collectively? What are we going to call upon school or campus leaders to do? That's just one thought that comes to mind. I do feel like that's an example of even just the fact that people still are moved to go to the streets to stand in solidarity or to speak out, and there's something that's unique there in the activism range. I do think you're onto something there.
I have a couple of small things to add, and I certainly want to continue to think on this question. It's a very important one. One is that, of course, digital networking is a very powerful way to build social movements. I think, and another is that in this time of the pandemic and a kind of stoppage of so many things and isolation, there's been, I feel like there's, more and more of a rallying maybe towards things we can change and do. And that's not either separate from the last year of our government leadership too, that all of these factors, I think, have contributed to a more galvanized public, even the vaccine now. And then related directly to campus, the School of the Arts and Architecture, which I can speak for, has organized our strategic plan around equity, diversity, inclusion, activism, to the point where maybe we abandon what a traditional strategic plan is about, but really with the commitment to say, this is a time of change, how will we make it happen? And I would like to know more ways that we can do that, but it feels that there have been big changes around organization on campus and of course beyond.
I think that's right. One of the things that in my FEC chair role I do is review all the course changes and all the new courses and all the new programs that are being proposed in the college, and the number of programs and inclusions now in syllabi of issues around social justice and trying to integrate that into a very broad curriculum. We're seeing a lot of that. But I think it's also important when we think about facilitating the leadership that students want to take on and the activism that they want to engage in. It's not, I think that's only really part of it. I think a really important thing for us to do also is to just not be in the way. I think we can be engaged in sort of leading it and trying to sort of be activists in our own right. But I think the question really should be much more about encouraging students and giving them the space to take leadership and ownership of their own activism. And I do think that a lot of things we talked about in the first 45 minutes really are things that do that. The things that create flexibility, opportunities for doing coursework in an asynchronous way. All of these sorts of things that we've been doing, if we continue some of them, I think that will create space for students to sort of use their time both to pursue their learning and other activist things they might want to do.
Yeah, Jeff, that comment makes me think about another thing I thought earlier, just about another sort of silver lining is for us as teachers to be much more intentional. And we're talking about the intentionality of deciding when do we really want and need, and it's important to be on campus, and when, where it might be either optional or actually preferable. And that's a level of intentionality that's new. And I think it's a good thing, not to say, faculty aren't intentional, but I think as we think about the different, modalities and approaches, many will remember that, before the pandemic, it wasn't like, online or hybrid learning, either, live or asynchronous form. It wasn't like there wasn't any of it. It was present, but it often felt as something that, well, I'm not really into that as a fact. I'm not really into that, or I can't really imagine how. And so being forced to experiment being forced to experiment does bring a few new tools in the proverbial toolbox, but also I think what we're a thread through our whole conversation is as being now having been pushed to be more intentional about the importance of social connectedness, and being very intentional about realizing what we've missed and how we want to bring it back. Being very intentional about educational choices, being very intentional about how we assess, being very intentional about the lived experience and how that situates us all. That's something that sort of struck me during our conversation today.
Clarence, thinking about social connectedness, it makes me think, to what degree should that be always a foundational agenda of the quote classroom? And how do we think about that? So in a sense, is education itself always returning to the question of social connectedness?
Mm-hmm.
Thanks.
Yeah. It's a fabulous point. I think we tend to sometimes think of education about, content and pedagogy, but it's all, there's always it's always relational. There's this old adage, there's a lot of things you can have or not have at a school, but you must have students and you must have teachers, and it's always found. I mean, I love that comment because it really takes us back to the core of what it, that it is always a relational experience. And so thank you for that.
I've been keeping an eye on a thread that's running through the chat here, and that's the question of what, if anything, we can maintain of the current mode of teaching once we're back in the classroom. I want to ask it as a very specific question in case anyone knows a good answer. Has any of us seen syllabus that would provide for people in person and some meaningful connection with a group that's also participating remotely? I mean, as a syllabus thought through, I have not. Is it even possible?
I don't know if it was me, but David, I think you broke up. Could you ask the question again?
Sure. Has anyone seen a syllabus or a plausible way of approaching the problem of teaching in person in a classroom, and also including people who are participating through other modes of accessibility, if I can put it that way? I mean, I want to know that it's possible, and I want to know that it's possible to do well.
So it's a good question to sort of leave hanging and see if people want to throw things in the chat. But what comes to mind is models, at least that I've seen, of for example, classically, you go to a session, and in the in-person pre-pandemic time where the session is full, and there's an overflow in an adjoining room. And overflow typically is you just go and you watch on a screen, but I think, again, people started to experiment with how you can have the people in the overflow room ask questions. In some, again, in healthcare education settings, having the patient and the clinician be in one setting and a group of learners in another setting, watching and interacting, asking questions or being asked questions. But the idea of, again, back to intentionality, I think those have tended to be more at the margins as opposed to like a plan. I think what you're asking is as a planned approach. I think it's a fabulous question. Bill, I know you had something you wanted to add in here.
just to comment a little bit on the previous thread or discussion about social connectedness and differences perhaps in the classroom from remote. I co-teach an Intro to Labor Studies class, and it coincided with organized labor union action on our own campus. And so I invited some union leaders to the classroom. I also invited a student group that works in solidarity with workers on campus, and Professor Tobias Higbee from the Department of History, who shared about 10 minutes of solidarity songs, old historical ones. And then the student group actually got the entire class, about 250 of us, to stand up, and we learned some chants. And then we went outside and we met with some workers who shared with us their stories, and then proceeded to march across campus. And it was the interaction outside in the background with so many students of all stripes and colors. Because this is a big intro class, and so you'll get a good number of Black, Asian, Latino, and white students. And I had so many of them approach me and say, wow, that has never happened for me in a classroom. And they really, really dug that connection, not only with the workers, but with each other, the professors, the singing, the chit-chatting. No way can that be replaced in Zoom, not even close. And I tried doing that this year, but gave up for this past fall. I'm trying to replicate that. The best I could do was talk about it, share some pictures, and wish for campus reopening when I can do that once again with the classroom and with connect with students in a completely different way on this campus. So I know it's a little bit different than what was previously discussed, but I wanted to share that.
I can't help, as someone from the arts, to jump in here, Abel, just to think about how singing and storytelling, moving together, making things, problem solving by creating, is one of those, is that range of activities that connects like the inner life and the quote objective knowledge area in ways where knowledge changes and is deeply synthesized. And I do feel like that's something I learned over this year with 10 questions too, that the importance, especially of non-artists, like arts majors, I should say, because everyone is creative, but creating together things or phenomena that would have, like marching across campus singing arm in arm or whatever, the kinds of things that would never happen when it's all going this way to this supposed organ of knowing. So I feel like I really will take that with me forward.
This has been, I think, a really important thread to our conversation today and running through the chat. I mean, what I'm reflecting on is, so in the medical school, of course, many of us are physicians, and I spend a little bit of time still doing patient care. So last week was one of the weeks where I'm sort of on service, meaning I'm, working with patients in the hospital. And I can't really put into words, but I'll just say I had the experience of running into colleagues who also were working in the hospital, that have been having like a gazillion Zoom meetings, and something palpably different about being able to talk and connect. And again, maybe I'm just old fashioned, but I do think that there's something here that we're, I think, articulating that it can't be captured. And that doesn't mean as a critique of the Zoom world, but just as a reminder. And it really goes back to this, as you said a few minutes ago, Vic, this idea of social connectedness and times where that really comes to the foreground as the primary value that we're trying to promote as a university.
If I may jump in, I'm sort of wondering if thinking back at the whole conversation from the beginning, how this remote has sort of broken down some of the barriers, accessibility, humanized, and also this part about, being in person. And I'm wondering if there was a sense pre-pandemic that, for better or worse, there was a sense of what should be in the classroom, how should, we interact. As David, you said earlier, that we have been moving more towards interacting and engaging with students, but there was still a sense of, there's a professor and we're talking to the students. And the experience of the remote, I think, has opened up a lot of faculty's ideas about, how do we get to know our students better? How can we connect with our students? And sort of combining that with, everyone's desire and thinking about what we want to do in person, maybe those two things melded together is our new way forward, that we are using the things that we have learned during the remote about ways to interact with the actual interaction might be sort of what we strive for.
It's a great comment, Kamika. I think that, in a way kind of, summarizes many of the things we've talked about today. This idea that we in some way we kind of need to, kind of collect all these great, nuggets that folks have shared in the chat, but our reflections are really riffing off of that, because I think there's so much to be gleaned, that I think I can imagine it turning into something that would promote intentionality in how we think about things moving forward in the fall when thousands of students flock back onto campus. We have about 5 minutes left, and this has been just a phenomenal conversation. I'm really very grateful to my colleagues on the panel, but also very, very grateful to all the great sharing in the chat. I thought what I might do is invite each of my colleagues here to just any closing thoughts that you'd like to share as we reach the sort of the end of our time together. And Abel, I'll start with you.
Wow. I guess what I'd like to share is that I remain very hopeful that we've learned a lot in this past year that we're going to bring back to the classroom. I, for one, am going to be much more purposeful in connecting with students at the beginning when I arrive early and afterwards. I used to do that, but much more hurried, much quicker. Got to get back to my office. I'm going to pause. I'm going to try to get to know my students a little. I know it's hard to do with lots of folks, but that's very important to me now in this post-pandemic, or as we enter a post-pandemic and back to hybrid or in-person learning. So that's what I'll close with.
Thank you. That's wonderful. Vic?
Well, I certainly hope to continue learning from this year and from all of you. The chat was amazing today, as well as you, my colleagues. But I think specifically and particularly, I'm going to be thinking about what equity is going to and access is going to look like as we move into the next stages, and to the importance of being a supportive connector for whatever the material is we think we're learning and the knowledge that students are bringing so that they can live more fully together. Thanks.
Thank you. David?
Yeah, first I'm going to be thinking a lot about the things that came up in this conversation, the ones that preceded it, the great stuff in the chat. Just, I love this kind of exchange. I think for me, it comes to a maybe seemingly paradoxical thing. I want to get as many people on campus, back on campus or on campus. Doesn't matter whether we think of it as return or a move forward. I want as many people on campus having the in-person experience And then here's the slightly contradictory part. I want to be able to project that for university as far and as wide and as deeply into home settings and non-campus settings as possible. It's the in-person thing that matters, but we can share parts of it and we can increase access that way. That's what I would hope for, both in our research lives and in our teaching lives.
Yeah, yeah. Thank you, Jeff.
Yeah, thank you, Clarence, and thanks everyone for attending today. I want to maybe just start by correcting the record. Earlier today, Abel said that he was pretty nice. He's in fact very nice. I just want to be clear about that. But I don't have a lot to add to what everyone else has said here. I really just, I think, want to take this opportunity to say thank you to everybody who has done the hard work of making higher education work. And what I think is probably the biggest challenge that we've faced in any of our lifetimes. And so I'm very deeply appreciative of that. I'll finish where David started. The incredible plasticity that folks showed, and you know, just starting in March, where we had about a week to figure out how to do final exams in a completely different way than we'd imagined, and then a couple of weeks to deploy a completely different pedagogy. And you know, we often say, well, we're a research university, and maybe, you know, teaching isn't really what we're sort of primarily or firstly about or whatever. And then the amazing thing is just how many people and sort of all of the people who really just rose to that challenge, and I think delivered something that if you had asked me earlier, I wouldn't have said that we'd have been able to do. And so again, I just say thanks everybody, and it does give me a lot of optimism moving forward, that we can forge something new and better coming out of this difficult period. And I again appreciate everybody being engaged in that work.
Well, you know, all you know, wonderful remarks. I don't have much to add except to say that, you know, to agree and say that, you know, it is remarkable to think about, you know, sort of the, you know, resilience of the human spirit, and I think about that a lot as I reflect on the past year in many different dimensions, and you know, the resilience of that, and our commitment to faculty, staff, students to you know, make the best of it, and lots of remarkable things came of that, and a lot of the remarkable things that we've learned. So I think walking away from today just has given me a few more tips to take forward, and particularly the idea of this centrality of social connectedness, kind of having that, returning to that as kind of the default, but being very open, maybe much more open than we'd ever been in the past, to the ways in which this kind of environment can be leveraged. I do also want to really acknowledge and thank Adrian and Kamiko from Center for Advancement of Teaching for putting together this panel, which I think we modestly, humbly hope that it was useful to those who participated. It certainly was a blast for us. I think I could speak for my colleagues, and we're very grateful for your leadership in catalyzing this kind of conversation today, and, you know, over time, both in the past, I know, in the future. So Adrian or Kamiko, I don't know if you have any closing remarks or to say farewell, but.
Yes, thank you so much. I just wanted to wrap up by thanking our roundtable participants, Clarence as moderator, and the entire audience for all of your thoughts on accessibility, equity, community, and student learning. And I found that in some ways, this session was an example of the ways that we can come together as a community to share ideas in a way that we really hadn't done previously. So I enjoyed it greatly, and I appreciate all of you. Thank you so much. Applause.
Yeah.